As you meditate, bring your attention inward to the core of your awareness. The inner space from which the sense of I arises. And let the attention be watchful, vigilant, not to get caught up in any thoughts that arise from that space. But remain in the natural, unfabricated presence prior to the I thought. With such focus on the silent awareness that the stillness is not broken by mental activity. And observe carefully if tension builds up and wants to erupt as thought. To understand at the root what that impulse is used to attain. but observe without tension, in complete relaxation. The nature of consciousness itself in this act of observing. And in the stillness, letting go of the root of thought itself. And the root of the knot that ties the attention to the body, as well as to language. Feel the freedom of consciousness. That is boundaryless, formless. Non-objectifiable. And feel how consciousness is all-pervading and all-encompassing. The longer that the silence is held, the more Shakti charges the consciousness with power. To overcome sleep, whether of the body or of ignorance. Be in the stillness without desire, without intention. And in the silence, there will be an occasional secretion of a thought that does not come from the ego. Trace back that thought to its source. And abide as the self. And now shift the attention from thought to feeling. Is the heart open? Is the energy of love flowing? emanating, shining. Does the consciousness have radiance? Does the energy of love emanate unconditionally? To all the contents of consciousness, to all that arises, all that disappears. All that is timeless. Does it fill the mind and the body? Is there complete acceptance? Is there contentment? If there is love, there will be no anxiety. No fear of life or death. And the love itself will bring you to stillness. Let the attention return to the organism, to the environment, to the phenomenal plane while remaining anchored in the noumenal, in the stillness, and allow the sensory input to be integrated into the pure consciousness without differentiation, without thinking, without leaving the state of pure being. Namah Shivaya. Om Shivoham. Om Tat Sat. Namaste. So if I say the sentence, "The world is not worth saving, therefore it is worth saving," can you perceive the difference between the two uses of that word saving? Or if I say the world cannot be saved from the ego level, therefore it must be saved from the ego level. It's very important to understand that every signifier we use has this double signification. That it can be used by the ego to mean one thing and it can be used to mean another thing without changing at all the apparent grammatical logic involved. And thus we receive many messages subliminally or supraliminally from various levels of consciousness that can employ the same linguistic structure to have very different messages embodied and embedded within them. But when we enter a state of complete silence, complete freedom from the use of language, then the mind becomes a kind of quantum computer where all the possible messages, all the possible meanings, all the possible permutations of the matrika shakti, the use of sound, of letters, of vocabulary, become in superposition. Like Schrodinger's cat, that is neither alive nor dead, or both, or undecidably in a state of unknownness. And that is what increases the potentiality of the intelligence of the infinite self to be able to be brought forth in presence rather than in thought. And when the thought springs out of that column of light that it remains unmoving, it contains the essence of that power that has been allowed to ferment its potential for delivery of truth to a point where speech can become mahavakya. And where the words point back to the silence and the message contains the source of the one who has transmitted it. We can get this effect by reading the words of great sages who speak in Chakra 7 and whose language contains that ineffable presence. But still, the consciousness has to be opened to the multidimensionality of the signifier in order to be able to be aware consciously, not just subliminally, of what is being inputted. So in the same way, Sri Ramana and others say that you are liberated now because you are always already liberated. You don't have to get liberated. The condition of the ego is completely irrelevant. The ego doesn't get liberated. And Ramana even goes so far as to say, you already realize that you are liberated. And most egos will go, what are you talking about? I have no idea what liberation is. I'm totally in Maya. I haven't a clue as to the real self. But that's only the ego, you see. That's the ego's algorithms of signification are irrelevant to the observing consciousness that is in quantum superposition with the ego, and that is not the ego. So at every moment, even though you may consciously identify with the ego, superconsciously you realize you are not that. And even if the attention is given to the egoic signifiers, nonetheless, the source of that awareness from which the words ultimately derive their capacity to be expressed are still coming from that source that is already liberated from any conditioning. And there is an awareness, if one wants to be aware, that one's playing a part, playing a character, a role in the drama. And there's a loyalty to the role being played at the same time that there's a knowledge that one is not that character, and that that character can at any moment evolve into a higher level of its potentiality. And so the more that the practice of being aware of the ego as a content of consciousness, rather than as a sense of one's being, but rather a simple movement of the algorithms of language that have been conditioned within the mind to produce a certain kind of thought. So long as there is a space of differentiation between the words that are coming up as thoughts or as speech, and the silence, the para level of consciousness from which they arise, there is a capacity for an intervention in language from that space of pure silence that brings the ego itself into consciousness of its luminous shadow, of that which is unknown and transcendent to the consciousness that speaks, but that is aware of itself as the ultimate source of that activity, in the same way that you're the source of the activity of the body. And that source inherently is free. And that freedom at any moment can be employed to break free of the patterns of thought that had been controlling one's destiny. So the practice of meditation maximizes the free will that enables one to dissociate from the thought patterns of the ego in order to realize subtler messages in every thought that are intended not for the other but for oneself. In the same way that every artist or every poet is writing in order to hear and to see, if they're a painter, to see what they need to see that they cannot see within, that they have to put outside as words or as characters in a story, a novel, or an epic, and thus to be able to understand a pattern in order to transcend it. Every thought and every action of the ego is intended as a message that can bring liberation from its own conditioning through the willingness to be completely accepting and understanding of this program that contains the anguish of an image that is crying out for love. Or running away out of fear of unlove, and eventually running away from love itself because of the pain that love itself brings to one who has concluded that they were unlovable. And so the story of the ego is always turning around the issue of love and lovability, goodness, worthiness. And because the ego is a complex structure that contains a superego judgmental voice that may tell you you're not good, you're not worthy of love, you're not a being who is divine, then so long as the ego takes the superego voice and judgment as God and as the judgment of God rather than the self that is completely unconditionally loving, one will be in a dyadic game of self-judgment and then projective judgment upon others. And it's this game that creates the karma and the inability to sustainably and consistently relate with unconditional love to others, as well as to oneself. But the act of witnessing with self-acceptance, that totality of the ego and the superego, or maybe many superego voices with different judgments and different fragments of the child self, that have been judged in different ways and therefore have reacted in different ways that can be triggered at any moment. The act of witnessing without thinking enables all of those fragments to return into a space of freedom, of superposition, in which a new kind of output can replace the old patterns, and the fragmentation can find itself in wholeness once again by being completely contained, all encompassed, rather than allowed to disperse and dissipate. And so in your meditation, you are collecting all of those fragments of the self and dissolving them back into the source before they had become labeled and stamped as bad or as inadequate or as some other kind of limited and insufficient capacity to satisfy the other. So Jose last night said I wasn't playing the part of the father, and it's important to understand what is the nature and the role of the father in the growth of the ego. And of course, Jose spoke for himself because everyone will have a different relationship. Some reject the father function, some need the father function, some need more mothering, some need more God as the friend. So it's not that there is a single role, but a relationality that will adapt to whatever is needed to fill the lack and allow wholeness to once again emerge. And instead of depending on a projection to be able to internalize and retain the wholeness of one's being. But the role of the mother is to bring the ego into being or into becoming, and to teach the ego how to live. And in the weaning period, how to live separately from the mother. And it is the father then who takes the child from the mother and imposes that requirement of separate existence. But the father's function goes beyond that, and it must teach the child at that moment of its capacity to function as a separate being, how to die to the ego, how to go beyond the ego, how to discover one's real self that was not created by the parents, and how to live independently of the parents' desires and fantasies and paradigms of reality. And so it's in meditation, by silencing all of those voices and all of those belief systems and all of those collapsed quantum wave functions, that one is able once again to know what freedom is, to discover your being in all of its quantum indeterminacy. That which cannot ever be captured by the matrix. And this is the real point of the life of a yogi, and why the yogi takes the vows that he or she takes, including brahmacharya. It is the vow to not be captured by another, and to not be captured by any thought form, not to be captured in the matrix, not to be held down, possessed, and determined in one's being and one's karmic obligations, but to retain the maximal freedom of one's essence, to grow and evolve in the way that one's own inner spirit commands, rather than what the other demands. It's that freedom that one claims that is the essence of one's nobility of spirit. That one will not compromise, one will not allow oneself to be broken by those demands or intimidations or abandonments. And one will not lose one's center, regardless of the treatment that one receives from the world. It's that freedom from needing the approval of any being in the matrix that gives one access to the logic that structures the world in its level of dream that transcends the ego's dream within the dream, that enables a vibrational resonance with the dreamer of the simulation, to be in harmony with the messages and the meanings that are delivered into the matrix from without for the awakening and the liberation of all the beings who are identified as characters with form and with limitations in time and space and power. And so simply by knowing that Shiva is the I, the absolute self is your I, is yourself, They are not different. One is able to be in alignment with that Supreme Self and to use the power of the Self that cannot be controlled, cannot be superseded, cannot be surpassed or overcome or dominated, to regain one's authority, to be the author of one's life and the dreamer of one's dream. And as this becomes morphogenetically disseminated into the collective consciousness, the dream of the world itself as a whole can be redreamed in the unison of consciousness that expands beyond the individual boundaries of a skin-encapsulated ego and becomes a network of beings who are all resonating with that same freedom, that same nobility, that same empowerment. And at that level in which all know that all benefit through the freedom of all, then the tendency for oppression, the tendency for hierarchy, the tendency for those kinds of differentiations that attempt to destroy the empowerment of certain beings in favor of others, that will be deleted from the matrix. And the beauty and the infinite capacities and potentialities of every being can be allowed to flourish and blossom within the space-time reality of everyone's arc of life, so that the life of the cycle of time as a whole is a blossoming and a flowering of all souls in every form of life in which they seek to thrive. And this is what enables there to be a Sat Yuga and a Treta Yuga and a Dwapar and a Kali Yuga, that every soul has its time in the sun, its moment, and every soul knows both light and dark, and all of the permutations of possibility in order to be able to choose freely. The destiny and the poetic purpose of one's being that brought one into manifestation and will enable one to let go of manifestation and be released. The moving hand writes, and having writ, moves on. But once the poem is written, motion ceases. Time stops. In every meditation, we reach that point that time stops. And it's in that moment that the freedom of the new, of the tabula rasa, of the unconditioned, can once more intervene in the flow of destiny from that space of purity and freedom that cannot be taken away, cannot be lost. It's that royalty and divinity of our true nature that will not suffer, that will not fall, that will not cave in or collapse simply because of a story that was told about it and in which it has been wrapped, cannot hold it or bind it anymore. And one claims one's freedom from the past and from the future, and allows that almighty power of presence to enter into the present as oneself. Namaste. The floor is open.
Thank you. That was very impressive. I wonder, like, after liberation, would the individual soul still exist, or that will cease to exist just as a whole? I mean, no more game to play. It's just end of the dream, all dream.
The sutratma, or the trajectory, let's say, of the soul from lifetime to lifetime, will have returned to the source. But the karma that has been embedded in the bodily activity of a particular being will continue until it has been completed, and a certain mission that has been exteriorized as an offering, as a prasad, will continue. But the individual soul will have merged into the Supreme. And so the evolution of the individual will be united with the Supreme Light and have no longer a separate, let's say, a separate trajectory. The light will have returned to the sun. That ray will have curved back to its own source. Okay. Purusha.
Thank you. A question from Lorna. Lorna asks, how can one, as a householder, remain true to this transformational work if one does not have access to or cannot yet be immersed in the hermetically sealed container of a spiritual community and the guidance of a true spiritual guide such as yourself?
The real spiritual guide is within. And if you have the will to meditate and can hermetically seal your consciousness from dispersion in meditation, you will discover that power that will guide you and protect you and keep you anchored in the real self, regardless of the circumstances. And you will find that the karma of being a householder enables you to have influence upon other beings in the context of that life form that will offer blessings and actually offer a kind of information content and wisdom that one doesn't get in an ashram kind of environment. And despite what might seem to be distractions from one's search for the source, but once one is in alignment with that source, one realizes that the householder is on the front lines of the emanation of love into a loveless world. And one has the challenge of bringing unconditional love into one's family system and one's neighborhood and social system. And one has the opportunity of shedding light in areas of darkness that would not otherwise be privileged to one who lives in a community in which there is not such a need for that kind of service or educational offerings. So I would see it as an opportunity rather than as a a lack of opportunity. It is a gift to be able to use one's life and one's karma for the upliftment of all the beings with whom one has relationships. And so rather than think of it as a problem, respond with contentment and acceptance that you have been chosen to create a mini ashram in your home. And by making that home sacred and every action that you participate in as a sacred action, you become the priestess of the temple of your abode, who is able to offer divine prasad to all who come into your life. Did you have a question? Is there a mic?
Hello, Shunya. I come from Guanacaste for a few days. Maybe in December I will come more days. My question is more related to the body, to the density of the system. I've been having like a purging of some ancestral karma. My grandfather and father died of hip fracture. And since many years, this pain started like going more and more. So it's can you comment on the physical aspects of awakening?
Do you feel that this pain in some way is psychosomatic and is a sympathetic suffering?
Yes, I've been doing many holistic healing therapies. Me, myself, I work in detoxifying through detox and colonics. And yes, totally related with repression of an unbalance of the first chakra, related to religious beliefs, conditioning of family, Latin American conditioning. So yeah, I see it very clearly. So yeah.
Well, okay, seeing it is step one. The step two is burning it. It's being disloyal to that ancestry and the demand that one carry the torch of that suffering as the signifier of one's identity. And one has to decide to be identityless from any particularity in order to become universal. And so that sacrifice will cause grief, it will cause pain, because one has carried it as a duty, as a burden that gave a purpose to the story of the ego's life. But now it is time to let that story die. And by burning away all the remnants and residues of belief about yourself and about that whole cultural construct that you just expressed, and allowing it to be dissolved completely into the light and the unconditional love of pure being, I believe that symptom will dissolve also and free chakra 1 to allow the kundalini to rise all the way to chakra 7, because it's the one thing that seems to be holding you back. The rest of the column seems to be very clear. But it was this demand to be held in this way of identification that now you must free yourself from.
Thank you. And thank you for this beautiful space you have co-created here. Such a beautiful Sangha. And
Thank you.
So devoted. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The whole Sangha deserves the credit.
Yes,
so
it does.
I appreciate your saying it. Okay.
Question from Margay, who asks, how does one deepen self-trust while knowing one is still at the same time being run by the ego mind? How does one begin to follow the true self before one has really touched it?
This is a very deep question. And so I think that the first stage of how one must deal with that is to face honestly the ego's narrative and its self-deception, its ways of trying to intimidate you or seduce you into behaving in accord with its demands and its super-egoic judgments. And the more one becomes the witness of that and creates a superstructure of following the Dharma, the Dharma of living in accord with a life of purity, of goodness, of wholesomeness, of higher chakra openness and activation, the more one takes those steps, even from the outside in, the more that the higher chakras will be awakened and activated, and especially the divine love, and then the wisdom, and finally the willpower to see through the deceptions of the ego and its limited beliefs, and to be able to be present to that much greater horizon of being that is able to accept and yet to choose differently from what the ego would reflexively choose to react with in terms of thought or emotion in any situation. And gradually one will be able to perceive and sense and taste when one is living in truth and when one has fallen from that truth. And the fall will usually come because one has been seduced into wanting to have a kind of enjoyment that will actually create a backlash of suffering. And once one sees those patterns in which one is betraying oneself and one is sabotaging one's own higher evolution, then one will be able to create a platform of consciousness. We call this the Viveka point, in which one will notice whenever one is falling into the Maya, the illusion of the ego, and will be able to retain one's status above the waterline of that illusion, and with access to the wisdom of the higher chakras will be able to change the pattern of thought and action to return to the truth. And eventually the habit of falling into the illusion in order to get an instant gratification that produces suffering by the ego will be extinguished. So it requires patience and vigilance and the awareness of a hunter that is listening for its prey and is always able to perceive the subtlest movement of the ego that would take one from the silence and the steadiness of the center of one's being. So the more that one meditates and attains that center, the more one will be aware when one is being pulled out of it, and eventually that won't happen any longer because one will not allow it. Anyone here? Okay, Purusha.
All right. Question from Alyssa. Alyssa asks, while on the path of the yogi, should one avoid any partnerships, specifically romantic, even if there is no physical contact? Does this just become a distraction? And if one isn't currently in a relationship, should it be avoided for the sake of spiritual advancement?
I don't think one can make rules about something like that because there is karma, there is a kind of relationality that first of all may overwhelm one's will, but also that a relationship of love can ennoble and actually uplift a soul who is in a state of, let's say, inconsistent self-completion. But if one's relationship to the other is one of purity, of love that is not tainted by desire, but is a love that recognizes the beauty and divinity and wholeness of the other without projecting the other as an object that one must possess, then that love can become a parallel enhancement of one another's growth, so that the love, rather than becoming a bondage, can become a mutual incentivization to rise to the highest levels of one's being. And if one approaches one's relationships with that intention of using whatever manifestation of love arises to bring one back to the source of love that transcends the dyadic nature of a couple that would want to seal themselves against the world and against God, to open to that higher nature, then the feeling of love can actually bring one from the projection of that love on an individual and the reception of that love from outside to a recognition of the source of love within and as the wholeness of one's being. So I think one has to approach it holistically in that way, and to be very honest with oneself as to the nature of what the relationship is about. And as soon as any taint of possessiveness, control, anger, frustration when the other is not giving you the attention you want, or the recognition and adoration that you want, all of those conditional aspects that destroy and despoil love relationships, when it can be purified of that nature, then the love will open out from being based on the projections of another to being an unconditional love of life itself and of consciousness itself and of the divinity of beingness, in which this profound feeling of love has been allowed to arise. So we must be students of love. We must be connoisseurs of love, and we must choose only the highest level and purity of love. But we should not repress or deny or refuse love. But we should not allow love to be defiled by enacting it at a level in which it creates bondage, karma, delusion, suffering, and ultimately hatred, because the love is betrayed by the ego's desire for possession and control and for the total consuming of the object in order to fulfill one's own sense of lack. If one refuses any of those inaccurate ways of relating, then the love can enable one to find one's wholeness and to be able to offer the vision of wholeness to all beings. And the love that was of two will become a universal love, which is the goal and the accompaniment of the liberated being.
Thank you. It's a question about this morning's teaching. I understood why we must accept our karma, but there was something you said that maybe you could clarify. You said we need to accept our relationship with God, and I thought as if it could be unacceptable, because I feel like my relationship with God is everything, and when I don't feel it, I know it's because I'm the one rejecting. I don't know, I think I misunderstood what you were saying when you said you must accept it, because obviously accepting karma and accepting everything that happens to you is very important, but one's relationship with God is everything. Obviously, I feel like for me, I accept that with great love because it's my lifeline.
But sometimes you don't accept it.
And then it's my fault.
Well, whatever, that's the point. You must ask yourself why. You know, there's no benefit in rejecting God's love. So when you say it's my fault, that doesn't explain it. It's a choice to identify as a being not worthy of God's love. Mm-hmm. Right? And that choice is a choice to be loyal to the projections on you of others in the past in order to have their love. You see, it's not a choice between love and nothing, or love and hate. It's a choice between God's love and human love that was toxic love. And as soon as one chooses to return to that toxic attachment to the human field of the others that have been internalized as part of the structure of egoic identity, then one loses touch with one's real being.
Okay, yeah, I was misunderstanding the way you're using the word accept.
Mm-hmm.
That makes sense.
Okay, thank you. Mm-hmm. Jose.
Thank you. I have been feeling a kind of, I don't know if call it a strength, but whenever I try to disidentify from thoughts and I try to put my attention on the heart, I don't really know what that means. Heart, I relate it to feelings. That's what Radhama has been telling me in the sessions. But I sometimes feel something here, like, I don't know, in the upper part of the body, a kind of strength, and in my intuition, maybe I could say that when the body is strong, the mind loses power over you. But yeah, I just wanted to, my question maybe is how to get to the heart. Can I put the attention in the heart or feel it through putting attention in the body in some way, or
no,
what is?
I wouldn't do that. You see, when Ramana speaks of the heart means center, core, nucleus. It's the nucleus of your awareness. It's that place from which the I comes. So it's not an object, it's not an other, it's not something you can grasp or hold on to or focus on. It is yourself. And so what it means is to let go of all attempts to grasp anything at all, to let go and return into that center of pure being. That is love. That's what you are. That's your true nature. But because the ego has rejected love and has felt unloved and has attitudes about love, so then the thoughts refract one's consciousness and distract you into the body and want to find different kind of strength rather than the real strength of the self. You don't want to depend on the strength of the muscles of the body. You want the strength of the will that is so strong you have the luxury to love because there is no fear. It's that strength that enables you to find what is divine in all beings because you know your own divine nature. That's your heart.
Thank
Priya.
First, I want to thank you very much for the guided meditations that have been very, very helpful to bring stillness and peacefulness to this mind.
Wonderful. I'm so glad.
Yes, and also the morning teaching today brought a lot of upliftment, and I think a more palpable sense of God's benevolence that has been rejected and not seen before. So I really appreciate that. And I had a question about it, about prasad. You mentioned at the end that to overcome bad karma, there has to be some remorse and penance. And I was wondering, is the penance, is that the surrender and santosha, kind of like accepting and letting go of it, or what does that mean, the penance?
It means burning in the fire of yoga the tendency to act out in ways that are not godly and not true to your real self, not royal and holy and pure, and that bring joy to your heart, right? But bring some kind of anguish, and maybe are caused by anguish from the past that has remained as a residue. So it's the burning of all of that anguish, all of that suffering, by the return to God's love. So penance is really being loved by God again, and basking in that love to the point that all of the suffering is dissolved, consumed, literally. Consumed. And it's this being consumed that brings you to the level of sumerience. That's what sumerience is. We talk about those three types of consciousness, of experience, imperience, where you're experiencing visions, but then you are consumed by God, and you are in that sumerience of God consciousness. That is the summa also. The peak of possibility of consciousness. And so the penance is really the self-upliftment through the burning away and letting go of everything that was heavy and material until you are pure light. Okay?
Thank you.
Was there someone else with a hand? Yes. Mahalakshmi.
Thank you for all the teachings. They've been incredibly powerful, I find. I don't have a question yet about this midday one, the superposition. I thought it was extraordinary, this idea that you have access. So I'm going to study it before I ask a question. My question is about this morning. It's very much in the line of what has been asked, of these three words that define grace. And you've talked about Shaktipat, and lately about being devoured by God and being delicious, etc. But this anugraha, I don't remember you speaking of it. And I don't know what it means to, you say it's a chiropractic adjustment of relationships of all the chakras.
Yes, like the chakras as the being aligned with the sushumna. From chakra 1 to chakra 7.
And then you talk about a kink in one's karmic panorama, kink being like a knot? Or
yeah, a knot or a blockage.
And finally you talk about simulation adjustment, that's part of the... Can you speak a little more about that? And also, it seems to me that what the world is going through is there's a lot of anugraha happening. Maybe I'm wrong, but I see a lot of changes constantly occurring. And I'm wondering if this simulation adjustment that you're discussing, adjustment, and then you said termination, right? You haven't talked about the termination.
Well, that's the prasad, the ultimate being consumed by God.
So, I don't know, I feel I need to understand it a little better.
You could consider it a personalized Mandela effect. In the sense that suddenly your world is different than it was a moment before, but it's different in an ineffable way. Something has changed. Some feeling tone that was there before is gone. Some new sense of freedom of your creative intelligence is now available to you. Your heart is more open. Your mind is more open. There is more of a clear will to take a certain path where before there was confusion and indecision. There's just simply a sense of being different, being more empowered than you were before, and more clear as to what is the accurate way of relating to every being and in relationship, of course, with the Supreme Self, and more clearly present in your life, in total aliveness and fullness, rather than a sense of being contracted in some way or closed-minded or hearted in some way. There's much more of an openness. And so everything is different. You're more alive. You smell the roses and the coffee and whatever else, and you enjoy the bird song, and you enjoy even the fog coming in, and you enjoy everything to the full in the absoluteness of the beauty of what is. So there is a sense in which you have moved from the relative to the absolute. And your beingness is not located within an ego mind any longer, but in pure presence.
Thank you. Would you say that some of these adjustments occur and perhaps could be seen as, from the ego's viewpoint, as negative until one is able to transform the understanding of those adjustments?
That is possible in some circumstances. When there's a transition from an ego-conscious paradigm of what should be and what is wanted and desired to a higher level of purity that creates a new potentiality for your divine nature to come in, the ego that remains, if this is not the ultimate level of realization, has to grieve the loss of what it had possessed. And that grief then, once it has allowed itself to let go of the past, becomes bliss, becomes the openness to the gift of what the new is bringing to replace what had been lost because it was no longer accurate to appear in the hologram. And so, yes, there's an adjustment that may have a lag time in ego emotionality to accept and to know the essence of the blessing that has been given in what to the ego is a loss, and what to the soul and the Atman is a great gain of liberation. So, yes. Shoaib.
Thank you very much for the teaching today and yesterday. I've deeply enjoyed it. My question pertains to the experience of understanding. So it's become clear that the real I does not speak. It's transcendental silence. The false I pretends to speak on behalf of the real I. And when there is a moment of understanding, it either says it understands, in which case often it misunderstands, and interprets in a way to preserve the status quo. Or it says it doesn't understand, in which case it's trying to understand something it cannot understand. But in both cases, it needs the experience of understanding to be objectified into words, to be able to speak about it. Whereas when I'm listening to music, none of that happens. Whether it is any kind of music, of any genre, I always feel that I'm having this experience of understanding. And I don't need to articulate it to myself. Although if someone were to stop me and to ask me what that meant, I could probably find the words to say it, but it would be like trying to explain the taste of a banana. So I'm wondering where this difference arises from. Why is it that when I'm listening to music, or sound in general, when I'm listening, that I don't have to go through via the concept, but at other times
So I have two questions for you. Are you now speaking from your false self? And if so, why? What motivates you to speak about this? If music is the preferred way of being, why translate at all this question into words? Why entertain the question?
Intellectual curiosity, I think.
Okay, so in other words, there is a love of the understanding that can only be translated into words, not into music. You see, it's a different kind of intelligence. It's not lower, and it's not necessarily false. I think you're incorrect to assume there's either the real self or the false. There is the buddhi, that is the linchpin between the two, that can translate as accurately as possible into language, which, yes, of course, language is embedded in duality, but even music is limited to sound waves. It's not light, and it's not the purity of that level of music that cannot even be put into sounds, because there is that music of the spheres, that even the music you hear of the most sublime kind is still false in relationship to, right? So we're talking about a spectrum that comes from that absolute, that is pure silence because all is known, of all the forms of intelligence. But that form of intelligence that can only be expressed conceptually is the form of intelligence that unites us in a way that enables social organization to accomplish the aims of bringing about a world of beauty, of goodness, of law, of justice, of fairness, of all the ways in which culture can enrich our lives and even create places in which music can be heard and in which other forms of the arts can be enjoyed and can be understood and recognized and spoken about, so that everyone can literally be on the same page in the acculturation of the ability to appreciate and understand that which is non-conceptual. Right? Which is why we're using words to even explain meditation, which is even beyond the taste of a banana in its impossibility to be expressed. And yet we make that effort because it is that aspect of our intelligence that is most directly connected to the self. And that is why the sages, for the most part, speak. They don't just play music or just sing or just sit in silence. That used to be the case, that was sufficient. Dakshinamurti just sat in silence. But it is through the use of the intelligence that one can go beyond the need to translate that intelligence into words. By grasping conceptually that you are God and that you are all that is, you are then able to let go of language that would try to tie you to some lesser identity. You can use that conceptual understanding to transcend the concepts. So all of the teachings of all the great traditions are stay in the non-conceptual, right? But these are written in books as concepts, because it is only by transmitting them conceptually that we have a stairway to take us to the transconceptual. So I would say it's a valid and a beautiful and poetic capacity when used properly in the service of reaching God consciousness, and it can be abused, and generally is abused, in order to foment a false self and to manipulate that false self into the stupidity of being controlled by minds that cleverly want to use language in order to suspend the freedom of the intelligence of others by putting disinformation as to their real nature into their minds. This is really at the heart of the ego. There's a kind of disinformation as to the nature of what and who you are, and why we have to then go beyond the ego and eliminate that virus of the mind that is destroying our happiness. And it is once we have overcome that, actually, that the music of our hearts and our ability to appreciate the music of the world and of the great musicians and composers also begins to flourish and thrive. Because there are many people who will listen to the same music that you put you into a trance, and they will be irritated and agitated and want to leave, because they are not able to resonate with the meaningfulness and the understanding that you're getting from those sound waves, because their own inner sounds of thought forms are creating anxiety and an inability to listen with the depth of presence that you are speaking of. So these different forms of intelligence are not in conflict, but the linguistic intelligence can be diffused and used to relate all of the others in order to be able to enable the distribution of the forms of intelligences that enable us to have a very complex social order to all be unified in accord with a single ideal that can be put into a signifier and create a symbol around which people can congregate and use to be able to reach that level of openness and love and trust in which all ego defenses can be put down and people can be together in a state of unconditional love.
Could you shed some light on how one can discern between which level of intelligence something is coming from?
Even the discernment of that will require one to be at the level of the viveka point in which one's buddhi is open. Otherwise, that capacity for discernment will not be there. So one has to cultivate that by having gone through a number of very low forms of intelligence and let's say, cognitive assertion that have been proven false, in order to gain a sensitivity for the nuances of expression and of intellectual propositions that can be empirically demonstrated and pragmatically refuted and recognized whether they are superficial or come from a deeper place, and to be able to be applied accurately in a given situation. This problem comes up in schools of psychoanalysis in a very important way, because you can learn all of the theory, whether it's Kleinian theory or Lacanian theory, whatever, and you can impose it as a grid upon your client and do it in a way that's totally wrong and actually cruel and we could say destructive to the growth of that being's capacity for infinite creativity by putting them, pigeonholing them into a certain diagnostic category. This is what psychiatric establishment has done to people. And now there are so many forms of mental illness that anyone who comes to see a psychiatrist is going to be labeled and diagnosed with one of them and given pills or sold pills to treat it with. And so we have to be very, very careful about any kind of conceptual proposition that is a projection upon another or even upon oneself. And the nuances and the sensitivity of the realization that nothing can stick to the real self. There is no way to capture it in concepts. There is no way to know it by grasping it according to some diagnostic manual or some appropriation of this symptom occurs, therefore this condition underlies it in the subconscious. There isn't a one-to-one correspondence between the symptom and the cause. And the same is true for allopathic medicine that would treat every kind of a physical illness according to the same kind of medicine and not regarding the psychosomatic dimension of what can cause symptomatology rather than simply chemistry or physiology or some other physical causality. And so the sensitivity is that aspect of our being that is in continual growth and deepening until we get to that absolute level, which is really quantum superposition, so that there is no assertion of anything, because the possibility of the freedom of total liberation is there in every moment. And nothing that was true in the past, 1 Planck second previous, is necessarily true in the next moment. And it's that liberation from any causality that is the true understanding of the real. Okay, I think we have to end soon, but go ahead, let's have a final question.
Okay, final question from Aaron. Aaron asks, must one heal the relationship with their earthly father figure to go beyond the ego? And if so, how does one do this?
Well, no, I don't think that can necessarily happen in every case. But I think that the fathering function must be fulfilled. And this is why it has often been important in religious contexts to have a spiritual father or to consider God as the father in order to wean one from the egoic life and enable one to take on the duties of a dharma that would impose the necessity for a kind of strength that the ego doesn't have, and a freedom from the fear of death that only God as one's father can relieve one of. If one's physical father has not been an example of one who has died to the ego and can lead one to that self-freeing release from the conceptual prison that the ego is and soon becomes as one grows out of its constraints, then one must find that fathering function either in God or in a spiritual practitioner who has no interest in claiming or possessing or controlling in any way the development of your being, but is able to give you back the projection of that capacity to cut with the past and with the ego that is that function, to enable you to have access to what you could say in Freudian terms would be the self-castration of the ego in order to find its freedom in the absolute that has no desires to hold itself within the frame of reference of phenomenal reality and recognizes itself as outside the matrix and therefore uncontainable, uncontrollable, and unchartable as to the depths of one's capacity to understand and to love and to release oneself from judgment. So it is that that capacity that is inherently ours, but must be awakened and activated by being recognized through the cut of that original connection to the mother and then to the Father himself, so that God is no longer another. Even God is dissolved in the realization that there is only the self. Okay, well, I hope that this has been useful in freeing your mind from any constraints as to your empowerment and your capacity to liberate yourself from the past and from any self-definition or limitation of your potentiality, and to enable you to open your heart to infinite love and to the infinite beauty of your being, and to bring that beauty to bear on the world in the form of purity, goodness, and an acceptance of the death of a world and the inevitability of its rebirth as a reflection of your own divine nature. Namaste.